Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. We know the story of Superman primarily from a Jewish perspective. The baby Kal-El, which means voice of God in Hebrew, rocketing off the planet Krypton just before it explodes. Then found on Earth by an elderly Kansas couple, the Kents, which is just like the infant Moses sent upriver to avoid certain death, only to become the supernaturally powered leader of the Exodus out of Egypt, making the Superman story primarily a Jewish one. But can Superman also be a Christological metaphor? After all, we've had a millennium of images of Christ as a superpowered flying figure. Can there be a gospel according to Superman? For Jor-el so loved the earth, he gave his only begotten son, with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, that he might save the world? Because for all their superpowers, the greatest power that superheroes possess, the power of love. Love for the friends they're rescuing, the people they're protecting, the universes they're saving. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Christ in Comics. My name is Arlen Schumer. I did a book about comic book art history in the 1960s, the Silver Age of comic book art, Silver Age, as opposed to the Golden Age, which was the late 30s and the early 40s, when superheroes and the comic book itself as a medium really came into its own. One of the many great artists I feature in my book is my first favorite artist, Curt Swan, the baby boomers Superman artist. He drew the character for almost 30 years, full time. And his image of Superman is what people associate when they think of Superman, I think, in the later 20th century. I took that center image from a 1966 double-page spread pinup. Now, the story of Superman, any history of comics discussion, must begin with the very first issue, 1938. The debut of Superman, and really the beginning of the interlocking of the superhero genre with the comic book medium. This is what's called the ash can cover, the black and white, not to be distributed image just to register copyright of the title. And this man is Sheldon Mayer, one of the many Jewish people who populated the comic book industry because it was considered low class. The high class industries, newspapers, they didn't let in Jews. So Jews could work in this new scrappy industry that was considered the lower tiers of the publishing world. And it was Mayer's job as an editor. He was also a writer and an artist as well. But as an editor, working in 1930, in the late 30s, his job was to find material from the slush pile to fill the first issue of Action Comics. And he was attracted to a strip submitted by two Jewish kids from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel, and the writer, and Joe Shuster, the artist. And what intrigued him about their character, which was drawn up originally to sell as a syndicated daily comic strip, as you can see by the format of this image. Superman, shown there, it's not what really intrigued Mayer, the fact that he was this, man of physical strength that could tear open an iron door, steel door. But it was the dual identity aspect. It was the man and the God, the angel. And right from the beginning, you have the dichotomy of the duality of Father and Son, and human and God, and man and divinity coexisting. images like this is not Photoshop, folks. This is an actual comic book panel, but it shows you the this almost Siamese-like quality of man and God. So yes, while Superman obviously has its roots firmly in Judaic stories, well, you can easily apply that, of course, to the story of Christ, his Sacred Heart, and the Christological implications of Superman and all superheroes, as I'm going to show you tonight in chronological order, are reflections of that. So back to Sheldon Mayer, he decided to push for the Superman as the cover lead feature in their debut title, Action Comics 1. And he's pitching it to Max Gaines, sitting down, original name Ginsberg. He's the guy that created the actual comic book. He was a newspaper salesman and working in the industry in the early 30s. And he realized the Sunday comics were what sold newspapers. So he one day was fiddling around with the format, and he folded the tabloid newspaper twice until it formed what we call a comic book. So there it is in the spring of 38, Action Comics #1, the debut of Superman. Let's take a look at the first page. You can see that these are pasted up syndicated strip installments in 3 rectangular tiers there. These were the 13 pages that Siegel and Schuster sold to DC Comics in 1938 for $10 a page. And by selling Superman for $130, they sold over all the rights in perpetuity, pretty much. So let's take a look at the very first panel we see of Superman down below. Champion of the oppressed, the physical marvel, who had sworn to devote his existence to helping those in need. Champion of the oppressed. All the aspects of Christ you can see in the very beginnings of Superman. This is from, I think, Superman #1 in 1939, one of the many stories in that issue. But I mean, there it is. Superman champions universal peace. The establishment of Superman, I mean, as a man of peace, is Christological in nature. Now, if you remember this photograph that I just showed you, look closely in the background. Could that be stories from the Bible? Yes. Max Gaines was a big believer that the comic book format could communicate any story of any type. And why not? The greatest stories ever told. So in the early 40s, he starts publishing these all through the 1940s. And you can see they did Old Testament and New Testament, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And there we go. Herod Agrippa, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And then you have other comic book publishers jumping on the Bible bandwagon, so to speak. Treasure Chest was an anthology title, and they often had religious stories, or I don't know, were all of them religious? I'm not sure. But you can see these are mid-40s, the different aspects of New Testament stories primarily. Well, I can't really say primarily. Well, 1947, that is around the same time that we see this Spirit rising cover of Christ, and this character, the Spirit, created by the Jewish artist and writer, the great Will Eisner. Why am I showing you the character of the Spirit? Well, obviously the name connotes a religious meaning. But let's take a look at young Will Eisner in the 1930s. He wanted to be a comic strip artist like every young artist wanted to be in that decade before the comic book took hold. But when it did, Eisner jumped in with both feet and immediately creates Wonder Man, which is promptly in 1939 sued by DC Comics, claiming Wonder Man was too close to their Superman, an infringement. And they won. And Wonder Man had to be put. So that soured Eisner to the comic book superhero genre. And right after that folded, he was approached by a newspaper syndicate, the Des Moines Register and Tribune. They said, we want to create a comic book sized insert into all of our Sunday newspapers. Can you create that for us? And Eisner jumped at the chance, but they wanted a superhero as the lead feature. And Eisner had just been soured on superheroes. So this is what he gave him. He gave him the spirit. And his only concession to him being a superhero, I mean, he looks like a private detective, is he had a domino mask, or whatever you call the type of mask Eisner gave him. But right from the start, Eisner totally translated 1940s film and what would later be called film noir onto the comic book page, really like no other artist was doing. And Eisner told stories from the gut, from the street level. And you can see how this beautiful drawing easily translates the film noir aesthetic onto his incredible title pages. See, the spirit would be the first 7 pages, and then he had a studio of other artists and writers that would turn out, I think it was a 36-page insert, I'm not sure. But you can see here that the focus on many of his greatest stories was on the average, regular, almost down in his luck, sometimes 2-bit hoodlum that lived in Central City, AKA New York City. Sometimes Eisner's stories only had the spirit as a symbol, as a presence. I mean, this story called 10 Minutes, about the last 10 minutes in this kind of young hoodlum's life, is a perfect character study of the types of stories Eisner became famous for and the way he told them. And his father painted scenic designs for the Yiddish theater in the Lower East Side in New York City in the early part of the 20th century. So Eisner took some of that Yiddish theater, the triumph and the tragedy of those stories, and put it into the spirit. Eisner would have holiday-themed spirit stories like the Thanksgiving spirit. Note that beautiful display lettering, of course. And then he always did a Christmas story. And of all the Christmas spirit stories, this one from 1947, I think, is the greatest. And to share that with you, I'm not going to use the original 1947 color version. I really love the more psychedelic 1975 version by the great Richard Corbin, the late great Richard Corbin, who was a brilliant artist in his own right, but he colored this version. And it's about a European, urchin left orphaned by the war, and how he has to scrounge for his daily existence. And his name was Joy. Beautifully lettered, by the way, like an illuminated manuscript. And you can see that Joy comes upon what looks like a ragged Santa clinging to life, desperate, asking for help. And then the miracle happened. Joy gave to the old man his last bit of bread, and he admits he's Santa Claus. Beautiful illustrations, beautiful writing, beautiful lettering, and a beautiful story. So look at what happens next. I mean, I wish we had the time to read every line of this beautiful story, but look in the center. He gives up his visa to Joy so that Joy can go to America instead of him. And I love this penultimate page where Eisner literally shows us Brooklyn Heights looking out over the bridge. Just a beautiful mixture of realism and cartooning that Eisner was a master of. He lampooned popular culture and other media way before others did. I mean, the great Harvey Kurtzman of Mad Magazine, who, as editor of Mad and creator of Mad, hired the great Basil Wolverton to do this unforgettable, beautiful girl of the month. But this came 2 years after Eisner's Spirit cover. Now, there's the great Jack Davis, late great illustrated ad promoting the first issue of Mad, created by Harvey Kurtzman. And in the background there are the other editors and the publisher of EC Comics. And that would be Bill Gaines on the left, the son of Max Gaines. Remember Max Gaines? He died in a boating accident in 1948. And he left his educational comics line, printing those picture stories of the Bible, to his son, Bill, who had to run the industry. Well, they didn't want to do educational comics. They wanted to do, along with his Al Feldstein, Jewish partner, writer, artist, editor, they wanted to do entertaining comics instead, particularly horror comics. These were the infamous horror comics of the early 1950s, one of the genres that supplanted superheroes. In addition to horror and crime, they also did incredibly beautifully illustrated science fiction comics with the great Wally Wood, one of the greatest comic artists of all time, being the primary illustrator. One of their titles was called Weird Science. This particular story, circa 1953, I think. Beautiful cover by Wood, and the story that the cover is the cover story of. And of course, we won't have the time to literally read it, but it's all about Earthmen that come to this particular planet, and they break off and explore on their way with their supplies, and they were all supposed to rendezvous later. Anyway, this one guy, Jerry, comes upon a little civilization. You can see in the bottom right, the creatures are humanoid, roughly to that of Earth 3,000 years ago. Keep in mind, this is 1,000 years from our 20th century future. So you can begin to do the math. Anyway, he realizes that he can help the natives with his advanced technology in healing. You can see down below. To him, it's a piece of technology. But he's immediately hailed as some kind of savior. And look at what our hero Jerry says in the middle left panel. This society seems divided up into two castes. The members of the lower caste are poor and undernourished. And then the wealthy class. He turns water to milk. I mean, I know it's a little heavy-handed, but look, the strangers turned my water to soup, bread, meat. He is the one who cured my sick child. But of course, he's only using his technology. Wait, you're wrong. My name is Kraft. I came from Earth, from far away, up there among the stars. So the head honcho brings him before him. And he's ordered, the rabble must not be helped. I forbid it. He goes, sorry, buddy. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to help those people. They've come to depend on me. As I see it, you boys in the higher caste have been taking advantage of your people, to put it mildly. Seize him. Well, at the same time, the rocket ship that brought them there was destroyed. All records were lost. It wasn't until 2,000 years later that Earthmen came back to this planet. And what do they notice? You can see in the center right panel, I noticed that many of your people wear it also, the symbol around your neck. Does this indicate that your planet has more than one nation, more than one government? No. This is a religious symbol, my friend. All Craftians wear it. The buildings are places of worship. Oh, I see. It has such a strange shape, though. What does it represent? It's in honor of the founder of our religion, who was the son of Mabuma, our deity. He was sent here and performed many miracles, but he favored and helped the poor rather than the high caste. So the high priest ordered his execution. He was put to death by torture on a stretch rack. This symbol represents that stretch rack. Rather a familiar story, eh, Commander? Yes, Nicholson, rather. Again, a little heavy-handed, but keep in mind, folks, this is 1953 when nobody was doing stories like that. Nobody was doing beautiful illustrations like Wally Wood that were symbolic of all these images that you've seen your whole life from the body of Christian art. So we're in the mid-50s. We're getting Classics Illustrated doing New Testament stories, the good old treasure chest of Fun and Fact, continuing on in the late 50s. I think this issue, we're in the early 60s, 1961. And around the same time, we get Catholic comics. And around this same time, 1960, 61, we get the first of what looks like a giant rectangular image to you is actually a business card size, almost like a little flip book. They're called Jack Chick Tracts, Tracts. That one was called This Was Your Life. You can see down below in this graphic the different titles of them. What are these about? Who was Jack Chick? Jack Chick in the early 50s he was a salesman based in California, but he had a creative streak. He was an artist and teamed up with a writer. And in the early 50s, he does a daily comic strip for a few years, which is really like the Flintstones, 6 years ahead of its time, before even the comic strip BC, which debuted in 1958, I believe. But it was not long after that Chick has a coming to Christ moment, and he is kind of a evangelical Protestant with fundamental Christian beliefs. He's anti-Catholic, and I mean, he's a character, man. But he found out from a preacher friend of his that Mao had success in spreading communism in China via miniature comic books shown here, or some of them are shown here, but that's Astro Boy in the top right. Well, that gave Chick the idea, and in circa 1960-61, he puts out this miniature little comic book flip book. This Was Your Life. Now, we can pretty much go through this and you can get a sense of his approach. He's totally quotes from the Old Testament, only believes in the King James Bible. Everything else is heresy. And again, a Christian fundamentalist with evangelical Protestantism leanings. The angel brings the dead man's spirit. I refuse to believe this is happening to me. Review his life. Yes, Lord. These are all images out of the book of Revelation, if you've read your book of Revelation. And you can see that this man's life was full of a lot of sin. Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Repent, come to Christ. Anyway, it was so successful that he literally started a cottage industry out of his apartment in California and created the Jack Chick publication. I think you can call it an empire, because here's the website. I mean, they've got it all. They've got comic book size comic books now, filled with all the same type of fire and brimstone, sermonizing, you name it. Look, you can get a trade paperback. Schiffer Books are a major art book publisher, all about the art of Jack Chick. And then there's even, of course, the dark side of Chick, the nightmare world of Jack Chick, and you could read about that. So we're in the early 60s, and now we get the very first underground comic in 1964, printed on, I think, the University of Texas campus. And it would be by an artist named, a Texan artist named Jack Jackson. And you can see his style is very Mad Magazine-like, taking the idea of God having a discussion with Jesus about everything from, you know, sex, drugs, rock and roll, current events, you name it. And Jack Jackson would go on after this to be one of the great underground comic artists and writers of all time, doing these incredibly beautiful historical novels about the history of Texas and Native Americans. And look up his work. He goes by Jackson now, Jackson. And there's always been argument that which was the first underground comic and which was the first kind of 60s take on a modern Jesus, because at around the same time, you get the New Adventures of Jesus by the pen name Fulbert Sturgeon, which is really Frank Stack. Very unique style, very kind of really that beautiful hand-drawn kind of look. But again, this is influence from the Mad Magazine approach, but instead of taking on modern culture, they're applying it to all the, you know, religious tropes of Jesus and Christ and Christianity and everything else to say what Frank Stack wants to say. If you want to check out his work, it's The New Adventures of Jesus. Obviously, he puts it out now as Frank Stack. So that was like 1964. In 1965, we get the publication of The Gospel According to Peanuts, which is a writer taking on Charles Schulz comic as a pop culture, Christianity, you know, mesh that Schulz, of course, made no bones about. In fact, when this helped influence CBS to produce the first animated Peanut special that aired in December of 65, they were really fortunate that Schulz insisted that he write the half-hour animated special based on his own comics of the previous couple of years. There's the credit with them singing at the end. But of course, we all remember when Linus, in the last arc of the show, gets up on stage and tells everybody, you know, the true meaning of Christmas, according to Charles Schulz, which is quoting from the Gospel of Luke. And it became an icon. Overnight, smash success, ratings, everything became obviously an industry unto itself, the Peanuts animated specials. But interesting that a year later in 1966, because they would rerun Christmas, the Charlie Brown Christmas show every year after that. So Schulz wanted to remind people exactly, you know, even though this thing became so successful, he didn't want people to forget what he felt Christmas is all about. Like I've said before, that's what Christmas is all about, Charlie Brown. You're right. So who needs Santa Claus, says Schulz. Well, the other great comic and kind of religious meshing in 1965 would have to be the publication of the first comic book history book, The Great Comic Book Heroes by the great Jules Feiffer. He was asked by the editor of Playboy magazine back in the summer of '65 to do an article about the resurgence of comics because of pop art and, the appropriation of comics in the early '60s. And he wrote the article for Playboy, and then the article was turned into a book. So in between reprints of all the early 1940s superheroes from both companies, DC Comics, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, you had the Marvel heroes, Plastic Man, and even the Spirit. But in between were essays by Feiffer, because he grew up in the early 40s as a kid reading these things. And he wrote them from that perspective as a child who loved them, who became an adult intellectual. And if you've never read them, they're really witty, very sharp essays, as only Feiffer can write them, being the great writer that he is. And his take on Superman was the first time, really, that the what he felt was the overt Jewishness of the character came out of Siegel and Schuster's subconscious or unconscious. That, as Feiffer wrote, Superman wasn't escaping Krypton; he was escaping Minsk. He was escaping the pre-Holocaust. He was, that was the destruction of Krypton, was the destruction of Jewry in Europe and coming to Earth, aka the United States. And that is really the first, I think, public exposure of Superman being a 20th century continuation of the Jewish American assimilation story. So that 2 decades later, the Village Voice in the 90s would have an article like this that would pick up from where Feiffer left off. So as we headed into the 21st century, we began to see books, magazine articles. Some of these are very, very current. Some of them are 10, 15 years old. Up, and oy vey, yes. But all of these were predated by the 1973 Gospel According to Superman by a Christian pastor, John Galloway Jr. And I guess it was almost taking off on the Gospel According to Peanuts, in that he posits the idea that there is a Christological nature to Superman and his behavior and what he does. Essentially, it's for Jor-el, soul of the earth. He gave his only begotten son with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, that he might save the earth. And it's interesting that never more was this Christological nature of Superman on display than during the baby boomer reign of Mort Weisinger, the editor of DC Superman line, the kind of capo de capo of DC Comics. He wielded a lot of power. And it's interesting. He started editing Superman back in 1940. And only one story in his whole career of editing thousands of stories ever had his byline on it, issue number 25. But he was also story editor of the Superman TV show in the 50s. So everything that the baby boom generation really knows about Superman comes from the mind of Mort Weisinger, as I'm going to show you. Kurt Swan, if anything, was Weisinger's artistic muse. But, he really took his job as a purveyor of kind of old school or even biblical wisdom being passed down to children, which was the primary audience of comic books in those days. Before the Marvel revolution in the 60s really hit, and older readers, college age readers came in. Weisinger understood that DC Comics, his Superman line, was essentially for 8-year-olds. And therefore, there is this Christological aspect of Superman saying, "Come unto me, the children." And at the same time, I think the life of Christ is reflected in Weisinger's Superman. You also get the death reflected, because some of Weisinger's most memorable stories that he edited, written by Jerry Siegel, the creator of Superman, also wrote the great 1960 imaginary, as they call them, that Weisinger innovated, imaginary stories. Of course, all comic book stories are imaginary, but within the universe that, a character like Superman inhabited, within the rules of that universe, it would be like a what if. What if we could do a story where Superman dies? Well, filled with very memorable images. This is, again, 1960. But as the procession past Superman includes, of course, extraterrestrials who Superman saved from destruction. But I like what this alien says on the right. He could have ruled the universe, but he unselfishly chose to help others. Again, reflective of the devil's tempting of Jesus to use his God-given power to rule over humanity. And then the story ends with one of the great final panels. I remember being a 10-year-old in 1968, reading this in a reprint in one of those annual editions, not the 1960 original. I remember my tears dripping down my cheeks, staining this panel. And of course, the Christological analog would be Christ's ascension into the clouds, also coming in clouds of glory, of course. Weisinger always said, if you try to be original, but if you can copy yourself something successful, milk it. So only a year or two later, I think 1962, you get another Death of Superman story filled with incredibly memorable Kurt Swan images, The Last Days of Superman, in which he thinks he has, boy, how timely, a virus X plague. But look at the opening splash illustration. How great is that? And needless to say, it's absolutely analogous to Christ being brought down from the cross, one of the major themes in Christian art through the millennia. In fact, it was on the cover of Treasure Chest earlier that year that this Superman story came out. One of the memorable panels was when Superman, again thinking he's dying, takes his heat vision onto the moon and inscribes, "Do good to others and every man can be a Superman." Well, of course, that is reflective of this excerpt from Matthew 7:12. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. These were the words of Christ according to Matthew. In the Weisinger era, there would be many such stories of ghostly figures in the sky, like this memorable story published posthumously, but it was originally initiated when Kennedy was alive, about Superman helping Kennedy's physical fitness program, which he began when he was alive. DC would always run public service comic book style ads like this one that would promote very, 1960s, mostly liberal concerns, very reflective of the Kennedy administration. And back in the 50s, of course, the Eisenhower administration. But in the 60s, Kurt Swan would give us memorable images like this. This is one of those annuals. I believe this is from 1964. And that atlas-like image, of course, can also be seen Christologically as Christ holding up the world himself, illustrated many times over in the history of Christian art. But look at this 1964 Weisinger edited story where Superman does use his superpowers to lord it over humans as king of earth, where we get to finally see the great Kurt Swan illustrating scenes we never thought we would ever see. Can it be the world bowing down to Superman? Good. I now dissolve the UN. The world is now one territory and it belongs to me, King Superman. This is the Christological nightmare of what if Christ had been tempted by the devil and taken over the world. A couple of years later, 1966, Weisinger gives us this story, Superman's Day of Truth. Now, why do I remember this story more than all the other thousands of stories I read? Well, it starts off where Superman gets sort of a little pissed off when he's at this judging a baby contest. Frankly, he tells the lady, this is the worst collection of misbehaved brats I've ever seen. And you try to flatter me dressing your babies like me, hoping I'd pick them as winners? How dare you? I never heard such rudeness. What's going on? You, the reader, are wondering. Lois says, Superman, did you have to be so blunt? Everyone's offended. Did you expect me to be a hypocrite and praise those little demons? We had never heard Superman talk like this. He meets up with Supergirl, his cousin from Krypton, later. Well, it started, Supergirl. I told some blunt truths at baby contests, and now my name is Mud with the parents. And Supergirl says, wait, did you hear about the lunch which the Supergirl fan club gave me today? And she proceeds to recount how she tells the girls right to their faces that the fried chicken sucked. They go off in tears and look at Supergirl. Sorry, girls, you asked her the truth and you got it. Well, what is the real reason for Superman's weird behavior? Says the caption. Let's follow him later as he flies to his fortress and sees him meeting up with Supergirl at the Fortress of Solitude. They put on their jetpacks and they shrink down into the bottle city of Kandor, where it turns out they're commemorating a Kryptonian holiday. And here they go. Long centuries ago, a ruthless swarm of alien invaders called Vrangs swept down upon our peaceful mother planet Krypton. And yes, the alien invaders proceed to lay down the hammer. They enslave them. They use them for sport. They worked them to death. They treated us like beasts. They humiliated us. They fed us from troughs. But after years of slavery, one courageous youth defied the conquerors. Who are you, stripling? Why do you not smile like the others? Are you not happy to serve us? I will not lie. My name is Val Lore. I hate and despise the Vrangs. I wish you were all dead. What everybody wanted to say but couldn't say. So they kill him. But by killing him, they made him a martyr. The people rise up. The revolt spread swiftly. The Vrangs fled in fear. Try saying that 5 times fast. The Vrangs fled in fear. As the elder ends his story, to honor the youth who sparked our revolt, a statue of valor was set up in every city of old Krypton. As Kryptonians, we of Kandor honored his memory too. And in further tribute, we mark the anniversary of Valor's death with a holiday, a day on which we speak nothing but the truth, just as Valor did. Man, I remember the story like, I hate to say the cliche, but it was yesterday. And not only is this how comics taught a generation of kids in my age bracket, but again, this Christological idea of sacrificing your life for others is, something that these superhero stories edited by the nice Jewish boy, Mort Weisinger, got across the Christological nature of sacrifice as only a pop culture medium can. In 1967, this issue of Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, in which they go up against the Fatal Five in a fight to the finish. I love the character Pharaoh Lad, created by the young writer Jim Shooter, as kind of a DC knockoff of Iron Man. But you can see that he punches Superboy. I guess he had the strength to knock him out. But he decides that he's going to take the bomb to put it in the gaseous evil cloud and save the universe, but at the same time, sacrifice himself. He did it. He saved the galaxy, but at what a cost. He gave his life willingly, as any legionnaire would. His legion career was a brief one, but his courage will never be forgotten. That special missile, which will stand through eternity, on the cemetery satellite, Shangalia, the resting place of heroes from all over the universe. Pharaoh Lad's sacrifice will be remembered forever. In memoriam, Andrew Nolan, Pharaoh Lad, a mutant whose non-human face was kept hidden behind a mask. He gave his life to save this galaxy. Well, the other half of Superman is Batman. They're the yin-yang of superheroes. Superman could be seen as the Christ-like angel come down from heaven to save us from another planet. And Batman, of course, is us. He doesn't have superpowers. He's us trying to be heroic. Created in 1939 as a kind of, let me try to do my take on Superman being so successful. And that would be young Robert Kahn, another Jewish artist, changing his name to Cain. And then his writer partner, Milton Finger, like to be known as Bill. And Bill Finger, even though he was the writer, he contributed more to the look and the world of Batman than really Bob Kane contributed. And that's a whole other story. But you can see from his earliest conception that Batman represented the image of the devil as seen through art of 2 millennia that preceded it. The images of Satan, the images of gargoyles, you can see in modern takes on Batman, like this one by the English artist Simon Bisley. And you can see how the gargoyles, with their bat-like wings, would later come to be appropriated by Batman. So when I found an image like this on the internet, it's interesting that they're conflating the sort of, devil/bat imagery with Christian symbolism, like the stained glass windows. I mean, these are the things you see on the internet, and you can read into them what you want, obviously based on this classic work of Christian art. And this is on the internet, where, again, you can read into it what you want, but the growth of the Dark Knight, the success of the Dark Knight movies in the last 2 decades or so really paved the way for these very almost spiritual images of Batman. But, you know, we can go back further than The Dark Knight, back to 1969 to this story with a Neil Adams cover, Die Small, Die Big. And it's about Herbert Small, big Batman fan. Look, he's got a life-size Batman robot doll, whatever that is. And he lives alone. Oh, by the way, and there he is, and he's kind of a two-bit, down in his luck kind of guy. But he's a Batman fan, and he hears a underworld plot to kill Batman, and he decides he's going to use himself as bait to bring out the bad guys and distract them enough from completing their deed to kill Batman. Well, Batman gets wind of it, drops in, pun intended, on the bad guys. Look, he says, I was confident that somehow you'd find me in time. I guess he left clues for Batman to find him. But look at what Herbert Small does. He takes the bullet for Batman. Only the mute canary watches Batman sink to his knees before the dying man. Herbert Small, you saved my life. What can I do to thank you? There must be something. Please tell me what it is, anything. I can't hear you, but I think I know what your dying wish must be. See the face behind my mask. He's smiling. He knows who I really am. Suddenly, unaccountably, the hitherto mute canary begins to sing triumphantly. And as Batman puts his mask back on, he died happy. But Herbert Small didn't die small. He died big. Written by the great Robert Kanigher, not known for writing superhero stories or Batman stories, but every once in a while he'd dip his pen into the superhero universe and end up writing a incredibly memorable story that once again comes back to this Christological nature of so many superheroes. Look at this Batman story. When in this comic book called Brave and Bold, he would team up with a different DC hero, or in this case, heroes. So where May of 1969, which means this issue came out in the spring of that year, the cover was by journeyman DC artist Irv Novick, but the interiors were by the great Neil Adams. And it tells the story of Bruce Wayne taking on as a ward or a foster parent or something, this wayward kid named Lance, kind of a kid from the wrong side of the tracks or whatever. Or actually, he was from the right side of the tracks, but he went wrong. See, he was also kicked out of the military academy. His father died of a broken heart, not in an accident. So he's kind of a bad seed. And he's fumbling around in Wayne Mansion, and he comes upon the Batcave. And now he understands, I've got them both. I'll make him pay for humiliating me, patronizing me. I'll make him pay the most. Great drawing by Neil Adams, beautifully capturing real human expressions. Ooh, are we jammed? What's going on here? There we go. Well, towards the end of the story, Batman and Robin are confronting the bad guys. And bad guys got one of those air hoses. But Robin throws himself in front and takes the air hose hit. And you know those air hoses are lethal. Okay, why am I not getting... Here we go. Suddenly, Robin, but you're dead, Stark, and I'm back to haunt you. What's going on? Bad guy shoots. Robin, why did you sacrifice the second time for me? Only way I could even the score. Even the score? Lance? Like Batman couldn't tell the hairstyle? Okay, well, a little artistic license. See, I had to even things up for what I'd done, being the bad kid. Because look at what he says. Batman says, why did you do it? Take Robin's place. When I saw him sacrifice himself for you, I knew at last what real love, real respect was. It made me jealous. I had to prove I wasn't all rotten to myself and you. Don't worry, Robin's okay. His cape saved him from serious injury. Fell into my boat back there. I switched clothes. Batman, Bruce, hold my hand. Wish I could have been the kind of guy you wanted. So long. So long, Lance. And believe me, you were that kind of human being. Down deep inside. Just never had enough of a chance. If you think it's hard drawing a man crying, try drawing a man wearing a mask where you can't even see his pupils, and yet you can feel the emotion of the writer Bob Haney's dialogue. And again, another example of the Christological sacrifice for the people that you love. Adams later that year, at the end of the year, would do his first solo Batman story. And boy, would it be a memorable one, a Christmas story. Night falls on Christmas Eve in Gotham. As the eerie bat signal shimmers against the snow-filled cloud, the atmosphere takes on a celestial composition. For 2,000 years, mystics have experienced the many mysteries surrounding Christmas. Tonight, there will be one more, the silent night of the Batman. This was written by a relatively recent fan turned pro named Mike Friedrich. Neil Adams, being the industry leading artist at the time, late 60s, early 70s, would often illustrate first-time scripts as a way of getting young writers noticed by editors. In this case, Julius Schwartz was the editor of Batman. So what's the Silent Night of the Batman about? Well, as we turn the page, it seems like Commissioner Gordon is inviting Batman in, not to solve a case, but to have a hot toddy and sing some Christmas carols. He goes, come on, it's Christmas, mellow out. And in the middle bottom panel, Batman says, why not? I can enjoy myself until something happens. So we turn the page, and Friedrich and Adams take us on a little tour of Gotham City Christmas Eve vignettes, beautifully illustrated by Adams, like a silent movie on paper, the essence of comics. And we turn the page, and you can see that the young hoodlums, once they realize it's a Batman figure, they rewrap the present, give it to the woman. So we begin to see that these vignettes don't actually include Batman, but Batman's presence as a spirit in the Christmas Eve night. So this man has a crisis of conscience and throws away his gun. But Adams and Friedrich save the best for last, the final vignette. A woman getting the letter about her husband in Vietnam dying. Remember, folks, fall of 69, man, there were still years to go in the Vietnam conflict. This was right at the end of the tumultuous decade that ended up pretty much being all about Vietnam. Looks like she's going to commit suicide by jumping off the bridge. And as what looks like an army truck passes behind her, she sees the shadow of what looks like Batman's bat symbol, but it also could be just the shadow of the bridge. She throws away the rose. The truck stops. Of course, it's her husband, alive. Beautiful lettering at the top there. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Look how Adams can shift from stylization in that top panel to the realism that was his calling card. What is the Christmas spirit in what looks like a ghostly spectral image of Commissioner Gordon? What is the Christmas spirit, Batman? It says, might it not be you or I? My eyes playing trips, huh? Amazing. We've been here, waiting here all night, and not a single call has come in for you. It appears the investment you put in the city is paid off tonight, Batman, giving you a night off. Investment, spirit of Batman, Christmas spirit. For 2,000 years, mystics have experienced the many mysteries surrounding Christmas. Today, there is one more, the silent night of the Batman. Adams would go on in the 70s to define the look of superhero comics. He once said that if superheroes really existed, they would look like the way he drew them. Well, he applied that realism in the early 70s to some offbeat superheroes. Yes, this is the nativity image as seen through the jaundiced eye of National Lampoon's magazine, when a couple of writers and Neil Adams collaborated on a couple of stories called Son of God. Yes, indeed, it was their take on the Jesus story. That was the issue of National Lampoon, appeared in January of 72, which means they created it sometime in 71. Now, you got to remember, 1971 was the year Godspell debuted. The idea of the Jesus story merging with the pop culture of the time. The year before, 1970, Jesus Christ Superstar debuted. So it really wasn't a leap that the Mad magazine of its time, the National Lampoon, would do a take on Jesus in the popular culture. And they got Neil Adams, the greatest superhero artist of the time, to illustrate it. And that's an example of what Adams liked to do. He was the most in-demand artist at that time. Marvel, DC, Warren magazines, everybody wanted a piece of Neil Adams. Well, you can see that Myron Cohen, Benny David is his name. He takes the name, but not in vain. And the little Brooklyn Nudnik is transfigured. This is a job for Son of God. Shaboom. But look at how he's received down below by his fellow New Yorkers. Commie, peace, creep. Hey, fruit, get a haircut. Homo. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And once more, the word is made flesh. Make haste, HG, Holy Ghost, of course. Round up the 12 apostles. The hour is at hand. I mean, Adams did not slough off. I mean, in these early Son of God comics, he put the same amount of work and time into his illustrations for his National Lampoon work that he was doing over at Marvel and DC. Sean Kelly and Michael Coquette, or Choquette, were the writers and co-creators with Adams of Son of God. I think this final installment was not illustrated by Adams. This is circa 1974, but how ahead of its time, battling the scourge of Islam. Well, right after Adams does Son of God in 1971, early 72, look at the last issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, the comic he was working on since 1970. But in the spring of 72, the May issue would be the last issue. So he and his writer collaborator, Denny O'Neil, wanted to go out with a bang, and they decided to take on the Christ-like imagery that you see on this cover. Now, What was this about? Well, this was torn from that day's headlines about the SST in 1969-70 being protested in the United States for causing air pollution, noise pollution. And by 1972, the protesters won. That's why there's no Concorde or SST flying in America to this day. So they decided to do a Romana clef on the story. And Adams, look at this beautiful pencil of the cover. Shows you the fidelity of Adams' drawing ability. But look at how it resembles Rembrandt's famous crucifixion painting's original drawing. I mean, that's a beautiful drawing in and of itself. And of course, it became this famous painting. There's a Neil Adams, practically full page panel, giving him his chance to do one of the great images of Christ, really, I think, in the 20th century. Anyway, he gives up the ghost. He gives out and he dies on the makeshift crucifix. And when we get to the end, one of the airline guys says, guess he was kind of crazy. And Green Lantern goes, sure he was. Mad with a nobility far beyond any you or I can even aspire to. And then Green Lantern's girlfriend, Carol Ferris, who is in a wheelchair and owns the airline, says, I suppose progress must always claim victims. And with that, we get one of the great Neil Adams silent, no dialogue needed expressions of indignation that Adams, the great realist, and yet there's as much cartooning in that image as realism. But you can feel Green Lantern's indignation, so that when you turn the page and you're hit with this panel, the impact of it is unforgettable, as is the conclusion. What's the idea? That was a $9 million aircraft. Send me a bill. Adams had created Green Arrow back in 1969, back in that team-up title. The issue right before that was a memorable issue as well, where Batman somehow teams up with a World War II character, Sergeant Rock. How can that be? Only through the magic of comics. But it's one of Neil Adams' great Pietà-like images. He did a few of them in his DC Comics career. But back to Sergeant Rock. Sergeant Rock is the co-creation of writer Bob Kanigher and the immortal legendary artist Joe Kubert. Sergeant Rock, World War II character with his combat happy Joes of Easy Company. You know, the stories were by and large standard war comics. They weren't really anti-war at all. But in the middle of 1968, look at this incredible cover that Kubert produces. Now, this is 1968, right in the middle of that tumultuous year, the beginning of the height of the Vietnam War protests. And Kanigher and Kubert have Sergeant Rock, ostensibly a World War II character, saying, stop the war, I want to get out. Now, again, these are the images that were coming out at roughly the same time as that Kubert cover. Later that year in 68, Kanigher and Kubert do this cover for this story about what looks like a hippie in World War II. But how could that be? Well, as the character narrates, I brushed the dust from my guitar. As Easy looked me up and down, Rock silently checked and rated me. He couldn't hide his frown. Rock thought exactly what I need, a guitar strumming hillbilly. The rest of Easy figured me for a burden, a silly Willie. Well, how does this character end up redeeming himself in the eyes of Easy Company? Well, he does this. He uses that guitar to save the day and save Rock and Easy Company. But you see that machine gun in the right corner? It does mow him down. So in a beautiful final panel, Rock says, farmer boy had faith, and he made something grow where it never did before. So we should remember what we're fighting for, to make things grow, not to tear them down. Make love, not war, indeed. But yet again, another DC mainstream story with that Christological message. Look at this Kanigher and Kubert story circa 1970. What looks like the end of Easy Company because Sergeant Rock is dead. How is that possible? In the story, they think Rock is dead in a grenade blast. And in this beautiful funereal image of their monument to their great fallen leader, they think it's the end of Easy Company. But as the story progresses, Kubert shows us a tour de force as an illustrator of how the spirit of Sergeant Rock begins to permeate Easy Company's very souls. Look at the caption down below. Rock was alongside of me as I snaked over to the rest of Easy while the enemy came closer through the fallen snow like gray ghosts. Look at this spectral image crossing over the panel borders, only to be topped by this final image where Kubert, the illustrator, chooses a thatched cross-hatching effect to delineate the spirit of Rock in the very air, in the sky itself, again, with a Christological nature to that image. 1974, we get this issue of Sergeant Rock, or maybe 1973, with a backup story written by Bob Haney, who wrote those Brave and Bold stories with Neil Adams, but the art by one of the industry greats, the legendary Alex Toth. It's called Dirty Job, and it takes place in Roman legion times. And it looks like three soldiers are hanging out after a job well done, but one of them is troubled by what they did. And, you know, the other his Roman friends are like, hey, toughen up, man. This is the job. You can't get emotionally involved. Come, Antonius. We're Roman soldiers, centurions, the best warriors the world's ever known. Be proud for that. Sit with us and have more wine. You'll feel better. No, Antonius says, I can't forget what we did up there. I can't forget him or what he said at the end. You turn the page. Just a dirty job that the whole world can never forget. It wasn't probably until maybe a decade or so later we get this image of three crucifixes in a DC comic, and that would be the Phantom Stranger. The Phantom Stranger was a character that DC created in the early 50s. That would be the early work of the great Carmine Infantino. They would resurrect him out of the 1950s in 1969 or so with this beautiful Neil Adams cover. And then the Phantom Stranger became an established character in the DC universe. So by 1987, a little later than I thought, we get this issue about to tell us the secret origin of the Phantom Stranger. Now, the Phantom Stranger was like DC's kind of Doctor Strange. He's got the medallion and the cape, and he's got occult powers, but nobody had ever explained his origin. So here we get the writer Mike Barr and the great Phantom Stranger artist of the 70s, Jim Aparo. To each his destiny, to each his fate. We are wanderers in a foreign land between the furrow and the stars. Men call me the phantom stranger and speak in whispers of my possible beginning. More am I concerned than my probable end. Verily I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Tarry till I come again is the name of the story. Well, Phantom Stranger shows up in a church and he wants the father to hear his confession. And he goes, are you kidding me? And he goes, how long has it been since your last confession? Longer than you will find readily credible, Father. And we're proceed to flash back to a story in biblical times in Israel, where he was a guy named Isaac with a wife named Rebekah and a son, until the day when the soldiers came to Bethlehem. We all wondered why they had come. And you can see this is the biblical story of the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, repeating the Moses story when Pharaoh decreed the firstborn Hebrews should be slaughtered. Well, Herod believed that the king of Israel had been born according to prophecy. And according to only, I think, one of the Gospels talks about the massacre of the innocents. Anyway, you can see Paro's really beautifully colored artwork here. But it was not until 3 decades later that I saw the man Herod's troops had been searching for that day and missed. His followers called him the Messiah. Himself he called Jesus. From the first glance, I hated him. He had lived, yet my wife and child had died in his stead. It was said he preached love, yet those I loved were dead. So what does he do? I was determined to revenge myself against him in some way. And soon my opportunity came. He had been condemned by the authorities and sentenced to die. I bribed a soldier to let me take his place. And after 3 long decades, I had my revenge. Yeah, he's one of the Roman soldiers that scourged Jesus, according to the Gospels. But I was prepared to hear him say anything except that which he said. I go to my rest, but you shall wander without rest. You shall tarry in this world till I come again. And sure enough, Isaac cannot go home. He attributed this to simple nerves, wanderlust. But soon he found himself wandering, and he could not stop wandering. He traveled the world several times over, longing for rest, a place I could call home. Now, wait a minute, says the priest. I was intrigued by your story, but how dare you enter this house of God and tell me you're the wandering Jew? It is the truth, Father Knox, says the phantom stranger. Yes, the apocryphal story of the wandering Jew, said to be representative of the Jews of Christ's time, who by rejecting their oft-predicted Messiah from the Old Testament would be condemned to wander the world forever until Christ's return as punishment for having rejected Jesus and rejected his message. That was 1987 that comic was published. I think it was 1988 over in Swamp Thing. The writer and artist Rick Veitch was doing a sequence of stories in which the Swamp Thing goes back in time to different ages of American and world history. Here he's back in the days of King Arthur and the knights. And then Veitch wanted to do a story where the Swamp Thing meets Jesus. And the Swamp Thing, who's got the power to imbue his spirit into nature, would become part of the original cross. This is all that remains, at least online, that I could find, because DC Comics killed the story and Veitch never got to do it. But somebody else at DC a couple years later got to do a Christ-like story in DC's mainstream line when this incredible illustration for the character Animal Man, a superhero, obviously with the powers of animals. But under the Scottish writer Grant Morrison, who would come to be one of the great writers of our time, he would deconstruct superheroes as much as construct them. And aided and abetted by great artists like Brian Boland, this very enigmatic cover illustration had to be explained. What could the story possibly be about? It was called the Coyote Gospel. What could possibly be the Coyote Gospel? Well, it turns out it's all about the dark underbelly of the cartoon world. No one in those days could remember a time when the world was free from strife, a time when beast was not set against beast in an endless round of violence and cruelty. It's Grant Morrison taking the world of cartoon violence very seriously and basically showing us how the coyote was sick of it and he was going to protest to God. So it was that on a day like every other since the first day, Crafty, the name of the coyote, went at last and said, no more. He took himself into the desert and went into the presence of God. Much afraid, Crafty spoke, saying, I will bear any punishment that will bring peace to the world. Then you must spend eternity in the hell above, said God. While you live and bear the suffering of the world, I will make peace among the beasts. That is my judgment. So God sent Crafty forth from heaven and earth into the dark hell of the second reality. And Crafty was given new flesh and new blood. The end, folks. You can interpret this as you wish, but needless to say, one of the most memorable DC superhero comics in the modern era, and yet another example of the Christological sacrifice. Now, we've talked a lot about DC Comics. What was happening over at Marvel Comics, where the Fantastic Four #1 in 1961 kicked off the modern Marvel universe that you know and love, co-created by the artist storyteller Jack Kirby on the right, with editing, dialogue writing, and narration writing by writer/editor Stan Lee. I really don't believe Stan Lee created anything. I believe he was a good editor and he wrote snappy dialogue and narration, but I believe the stories and characters at Marvel Comics, especially the Foundation, were totally created by Jack Kirby. I mean, he used the Fantastic Four as his launching pad to basically give us the Marvel universe. By 1965, only an artist of Kirby's magnitude could have illustrated a cover filled with every one of the characters he created or co-created in cahoots with Lee, who would again dialogue Kirby's stories, which were like silent movies on paper. I adapted that image into this double-page spread in the Kirby chapter of my Silver Age book because it's the character Kirby most identified with. The way the thing talks and acts, you'll find that he is really Jack Kirby. He has my manners. He has my manner of speech, and he thinks the way I do. He's excitable, very active among people, and he can muscle his way through a crowd. I'm that sort of person. Kirby, circa 1970, whenever he would draw an autobiographical image, it would always be of himself as the thing, which is why this issue of the Fantastic Four, appearing in the early spring of 1966, is considered among Marvel Comics aficionados as the single greatest story in the Marvel Comics era of the Silver Age of the 1960s. This man, this monster. Not only was that a great cover, but how about that splash, pun intended, image, one of Kirby's greatest. Once again, the layman or average comic fan looks at those credits and thinks by Stan Lee being billed as the writer, it meant that he created the story. No, this is Kirby's story, though he's only billed as penciler. Kirby told the stories as silent movies on paper. What you're reading in this story is Stan Lee's dialogue over Kirby's silent movie drawings. But it's about a bad guy that is really wants to have his revenge on Reed Richards and Fantastic Four, and he somehow is able to duplicate himself as a perfect carbon copy of the Thing. And by subduing the real Thing and taking his place, he can get into the Baxter building, the Fantastic Four's headquarters, and kill Reed Richards. Well, Reed Richards is in the Baxter building, but he's actually in the negative zone, which is an interdimensional portal in the Baxter building. And as you can see, once again, this is Stan Lee dialogue of Kirby's story about how he's trapped in the negative zone where all matter is being sucked into the center where it will explode. And outside the negative zone in the Baxter building, the AirSats Thing, the other members of Fantastic Four don't know that he's an imposter. They think he's Ben Grimm. But look at what he's thinking all of a sudden. All of a sudden, I don't envy him anymore. I never knew how brave he was, how unselfish. All these years when I thought I never got the breaks, now I know the truth. It was my fault, nobody else's. I wouldn't work hard enough. I wouldn't make the sacrifices that a Reed Richards would. I never saw things so clear before. It's almost like I've really become the Thing, not just an imitation. I never did a worthwhile thing in my whole life, but now I finally got the chance. I can really be Ben Grimm. I've got to do it. I'll save Richards. Don't worry, lady. I'll get him now. You wait out there, baby. I'll whistle if I need you. Maybe if I'm lucky, I can still grab that busted hunk of line before it's too late. He gets inside the negative zone, gets to Reed Richards, and he's about to hurl him back outside. Suddenly, maybe we don't have to die. Both have to die, Mr. Ben, what are you doing? But maybe I can use that strength to even the score somehow. I tossed him back in exactly the same direction he came from. He's out of sight now, so I'll never know. So long, Richards. I hope you make it. As for me, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself. Not many men get a second chance to make up for the rotten things they've done in their lifetime. I guess I'm luckier than most. I got that chance, for I finally learned what it means to have a friend and what it means to sacrifice yourself for your friends. Kirby did some incredibly biblically, classically inspired images, like this take on the, of course, I call this Kirby's Pietà, because how can it not be just a beautiful comic book version of Michelangelo's famous sculpture? Michelangelo, considered the greatest artist of all time, but Jack Kirby is considered the greatest superhero artist of all time and the greatest creator of characters and concepts that are still being milked 50, 60 years after he created them. After Kirby's creations in the 60s, we get the mid-60s creations of these superheroes. They would be known as the Thunder Agents, who appeared in the summer of 65, created and illustrated. If you can't recognize that style, remember the great 50s science fiction artist, Wally Wood? Well, in the early 60s, he came to nascent Marvel Comics and immediately redesigned Daredevil, giving him the red suit that he still uses today. And this being one of the most memorable images from one of the most memorable stories that Wally Wood wrote and drew, and Stan Lee, of course, dialogued over. But sometime in early 65, he was approached by a publisher to have his own line of superhero comics to compete with DC and Marvel, ones that he would have control over editorially. And those became the Thunder Agents, which stood for the Higher United Nations Defense and something Force, or whatever the hell it was. But let's concentrate on Dynamo, or Dynamo as I called him, on the left, and this character Mentor. Here they are on the cover of actually the very first Thunder Agents. So you can see that Mentor right away was being cover featured along with Dynamo or Dynamo. And you can see No Man and spectral image on the right side of that beautiful Wally Wood cover. But perhaps the most memorable Thunder Agent story of them all, and Thunder only lasted a couple of years. By 67, 68, they were gone. But the greatest story was actually written by an inker named Dan Adkins, who didn't even ink the story. This story was penciled by Steve Ditko and inked by Wally Wood. But Dan Adkins wrote it. It's called A Matter of Life and Death. And what is it about? It's about Mentor taking the bullets, taking the heat, so that his fellow Thunder Agents could save the day. And as we get to the end, Dynamo turns and returns to the crumpled figure of his fallen comrade and lifts the still form as tenderly as a baby. The other agents follow in respectful silence. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. He died to save us. John, we'll get them for you. We'll get every last one of them. Greater love hath no man than that he laid down his life for his friend. In the early 70s, Marvel would give us characters that had a Christ-like persona or aura, like Gil Kane's Warlock, who had really unfathomable power, but often pictured in crucifix-like poses by his original artist, Gil Kane, and by other artists that followed. In the late 80s, we got this Daredevil story written by Frank Miller and drawn by David Mazzucchelli. I don't know if you can read the type at the bottom. It's called Born Again. And Frank Miller, of course, a couple of years earlier, revolutionized mainstream superhero comics with his Dark Knight Returns. But he always had a foot over at Marvel. He made his bones with Daredevil. And he writes a story all about how Matt Murdock, his civilian lawyer alter ego, loses everything. His home, his possessions, his finances, everything. He hits rock bottom. And he practically loses his life until he is literally born again. And if you've never read this story, it's been collected in beautiful editions, but it's one of the great Frank Miller and great Daredevil stories that co-ops major Christian imagery, like this beautiful spread with its crucifix-like layout. And there's the final issue. These are the individual issues that were collected. In the turn of the century, we've got an array of books that look at the godlike and Christological nature of the superheroes and how they're all reflections of our religious and mythical figures. One book after the other. Do the gods wear capes? Spirituality, fantasy and superheroes. Grant Morrison, remember him? He wrote a book a couple years ago, his take on the subject called Super Gods. Warren Ellis, the English writer, created a comic with the name Super God, and you can see this meshing of Christ-like and superhero imagery. Recently, we've had more traditional takes on Christ in comics, like Sergio Cariello, who's a mainstream Marvel artist, I think, has been doing volumes of the Action Bible, which is sort of, I don't know, conventional comic art, I would call it, but with a very kind of pumped up version of Jesus, a little too right-wing for my taste. I much prefer the radical Jesus coming from more the underground comic direction. There have been stories about Jesus being more of a left-wing radical, as in many of his policies about sharing possessions and wealth. And you can see this collection that was recently put together is a good starting collection to show you the types of graphic histories of Jesus and his concepts. Of late, there have been some very interesting takes on a kind of a second coming of Jesus. Mark Millar is another United Kingdom writer. Peter Gross, an interesting artist. First, they did American Jesus. I think this is the same book, but it's a different collection. You've got Chosen, or I don't know if this is the same story, maybe the sub book. One of the most offbeat Christ in comics of recent vintage would be this multiple issue miniseries called Judas, which takes a very apocryphal take on the story of Judas, that he was predestined by Jesus himself to go into hell and be there to help guide him when, according to one of the apocryphal gospels, that he descended into hell for those 3 days, and that Judas would be his helper, his companion. I don't think you've been told this before, but I'm sorry, Judas, says Jesus. I'm sorry you never had a chance to be anything else. We're the same in that way, trapped in the story. What story? The only story. My favorite story that has to do with Christ in comics in the 20th century, or maybe this was late, or 21st century, or maybe late 20th century, but it's the graphic novel by Chester Brown called Ed the Happy Clown. Not so much the story of Ed, but when it was serialized as single issues, in the back of each issue of Ed the Happy Clown, which, by the way, I'm only giving you a small tasting, but if you want to read it, it'll blow your mind. It's like David Lynch if he were an underground comic artist. Maybe that simplifies things too much. Notice how his name is Christian here, because in the back of each issue for a time, Chester Brown was giving us his take on the 4 Gospels, starting with Mark, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. And in his own inimitable black and white style, which is a cross between cartooning and realism in my mind, he does a very traditional yet radical take on the visualization of Jesus in the Gospels. Because for each gospel, he does Christ a different way. But you can see he's true to the text, using the Aramaic talitha kum, if you've read your Mark. But you can see this version of Jesus is more like kind of a gentle, kind of the gentle side of Jesus. But, again, a traditional telling. He doesn't he doesn't shy away from giving us, again, a cross between realism and cartooning. That's what I love about Chester Brown. But you can see this is pretty traditional adaptation. He draws each panel separately as a square and pastes them up. He doesn't really care about page layout. He believes in the proscenium arch style of comic storytelling, in which it's what's going on inside the panel. The page design, the panel designs should only function like the proscenium arch on stage. But look at this offbeat beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. And now we're starting to see a different version of Jesus. The man who comes not with, he comes with a sword, but you can see in Brown's, again, a cross between cartooning and realism. And I love this very Jewish Old Testament prophet Jesus, angry. Well, not really angry, but rebuking. Man, just beautiful drawing. But perhaps my favorite modern take on Christ in comics that I'm going to end this presentation with is David Wilkie's inimitable Coffee with Jesus. Is it blasphemous? Of course not. But it's Coffee with Jesus. Using clip art, Wilkie is able to really do some fun stuff. The young men need to see a tough Jesus, a sword-wielding, muscle-bound, long-haired, take no prisoners, action hero, badass. You guys are always trying to remake me. It wasn't that long ago you painted me as a Southern California surfer with blue contact lenses. How about we emphasize the carpentry aspect a little more? Maybe your gimmick could be a huge hammer, or better yet, a saw. Wait, I've got it. What if my superpower was, oh, this is so good, forgiveness? That would be so radical. You guys think you could work with that? It's weird, Jesus, but I just met some followers of yours who are on the complete opposite end of the political spectrum from me. Gasp. Very funny, Jesus, but I just don't see how they can reconcile their faith with their position on. I'll handle the reconciling, Anne. Your job is to love them, or maybe just not hate them. Baby steps. I won't believe someone who simply says, I'm a Christian, Jesus. They better show me some fruit. So you're the fruit inspector, Lisa? How about you take them at their word until they prove otherwise? As you wish, Jesus, but they better be able to answer what I ask. When and where did you come to know Jesus? Now you're doing background checks? I like my fruit sweet, Lisa, and yours is not quite ripe yet. Look at how Wilkie gives us this beautiful little disclaimer at the end. Years ago, I knew a retired missionary was the sweetest, most godly man I've ever met. I thought of him as holy. He was what we in Christendom call mature in the faith. I thought it was because he'd lived a life of sacrifice and service. Sure, that was part of it, but what this dear old saint had was humility. Now I think to be mature in the faith is to know you don't have all the answers, that God judges the heart, that we must love above all else. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you felt the love that I've tried to get across in this webinar. It's one of my many comics history projects, webinars, lectures, articles, books. You can find a lot of them at my website on the comic book history subpage. It's linked to my book site where I'll sign and sketch in a hardcover for you. My book is really the only book of its type that is about the art. And I even take out the original word balloons and put the artist talking about the art. So you read my book like a giant comic book, but it's an art book and a history book as well. I run a Facebook group on the Silver Age. I run one on just Jack Kirby's work and one just on Neil Adams' work. He influenced my own illustration the most, doing comic art, but for advertising and magazines. One of my specialties I call finding your inner superhero, where I maintain the photographic likeness of the person, but merge it with the black outlines of comic book art. I'm hooked up with a merchandising site, TeePublic, which has over 125 of my images in every kind of conceivable gewgaw, knick-knack, and tchotchke you could think of. Yes, even my Jesus in dots image is available as a t-shirt, poster, you name it. Get your very own and support your local artists. Even the logo for this show is available, Christ in Comics. My own Pop Culture Man site, link from my website, has posters of many of the images not available at TeePublic. My visual lectures and webinars are, I used to call what I did live visual lectures. I hope with the pandemic lifting, I can get back to that. But you can see videos of many of my old live lectures and my more recent webinars on my YouTube channel. And ever since the pandemic shut down a year ago, I've been blessed to hook up with the New York Adventure Club, doing webinars for them, which are paid events. If you go to nyadventureclub.com, they're only $10, but I'll be doing John Henry, the first American superhero, for them later this month on Tuesday, the 29th at 8 o'clock. Again, nyadventureclub.com. But on my own, every Wednesday night in June, I'll be doing another free webinar. So next Wednesday night, I'll be doing New York comics, how New York City itself has become a character in the history of comics. The week after, Wednesday, 6 o'clock p.m., that would be June 23rd, the Sean Connery Bond canon, the first 4 films. I'll be doing Thunderball to wrap up that webinar series. And then the last week, Wednesday in June, I've been doing a monthly Great Comic Book Artists of the Silver Age based on the artists in my book. So I will be doing a reprise, because I screwed up the recording, of the great Steve Ditko versus Romita Spider-Man debate. Who drew him better? So for all of these free events, just go to the events blog page on my website, and you can see I post all of my comings and goings with all the links so that you can see me. So again, everybody who came tonight, I want to thank you, and I hope to see you further on up the road at my future pop culture webinars. Bye-bye.
Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.